And I would appreciate if everybody would stay muted whilst we're listening, unless you are asked to say something or want to say something. So please be muted. Thank you, everybody. Again, a very warm welcome, and we'll start as per normal with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Creator God, we give you thanks for bringing us together this evening. Help us to recognize you in one another. We ask that you open our hearts and our minds to what is good around us. May we all learn your will. And we make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
This is the third of our webinars, and we have two fabulous speakers for you this evening. I'm just going to tell you very quickly that we'll have a speaker and then 10 minutes for a little bit of chat. Then our second speaker and about 10 minutes for another chat. And if we any more than 15 people, we'll break up into breakout rooms so that we can really have a good discussion where every individual will be able to have his or her say. And then in each of those groups, we'll have a reporter so that, you know, somebody reports back to the main group for the last 10 minutes. And that will just allow everyone in the group to be able to have his or her say. I hope that's okay with everyone. Our first speaker tonight is Richard Zipfel, and most of you would have heard him or even know him. Richard is a founder member of the Catholic Association for Racial Justice, and he is also our secretary. Richard will be discussing some of the legislation, organizations, and reports which have helped to combat racism in the period 1947 to 1985. He will also recall a few of the many Black British individuals whose particular contribution has helped in making Britain a more inclusive society. We still have a very long way to go, and Richard is aware of that. But it is also important this evening to acknowledge the efforts that have been made over the past 75 years. So we're going to hand over to Richard Zipfel now. Richard?
Thank you, Yogi. As Yogi said, I'm going to look at 4 areas where individuals and society and organizations have tried to combat racism in the years between 1947 and 1985. And I'm going to start with the government and a few pieces of legislation in the 1960s and 1970s. The Race Relations Act 1965 was the first piece of legislation in the UK to prohibit racial discrimination. Oh, sorry. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay, there we are. This first act, Race Relations Act, banned racial discrimination in public places. And by that is meant it banned racial discrimination, especially in hotels, restaurants, cafes, swimming pools, and other places which were designed to be for the service of the public. It also made the promotion of hatred an offense. So this was, if you want, a good start. But as you'll see, the legislation gradually evolved, and hopefully, I would think, became more adequate. The Race Relations Act 1968 made it illegal to refuse housing, employment, or public services to a person on the grounds of color, race, ethnic, or national origins. And it also created a new commission to help in that process. Almost 10 years later, the Race Relations Act 19, next slide, please. Gloria?
Sorry, give me 1 second.
Okay, in 1976, the Act made it unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of race, color, nationality, and national or ethnic origin. That act covers employment, education, training, housing, and the provision of goods, facilities, and services. In addition to direct discrimination, the law forbids indirect discrimination, victimization, and segregation. This was an important step, making indirect discrimination illegal, made it possible to use the law to try to make sure that people weren't finding ways to discriminate, like requiring that an applicant for a
One was Greece under the code, and I think the other was Russia. It's not difficult to make those comparisons if you behave in a way that
It is important that everybody remains muted, please, because we're getting a lot of background noise. If people are not muted, we'll pick up every bit of noise.
If you can unmute yourself, Richard, thank you.
Thank you. Indirect discrimination is when someone like an employer or an educator uses something other than race to have an effect of discriminating on racial grounds. So, for instance, if a school required university education of someone they were employing to be a cook. Obviously, that's a bit silly, but you can see how that took the law forward. And so we have those three acts in the 60s and 70s that gradually tried to make discrimination on racial grounds illegal. And it was a long and important process. And I think a positive process. Okay, next slide, please. During the same period, a few organizations were growing up which had a specific intention of promoting better race relations. The National Council for Civil Liberties was founded in 1934. It was an advocacy group and a membership organization. It meant to challenge unjust laws, and it had a kind of legal focus. It protected civil liberties and promoted human rights. It became Liberty, the organization Liberty, in 1989, and Liberty is today the UK's largest civil liberties organization with 15,000 members. Alongside NCCL, the Runnymede Trust is a British race equality and civil rights think tank. It was founded by Jim Rose and Anthony Lester as an independent source for generating ideas for a multi-ethnic Britain through research, network building, debate, and policy engagement. Runnymede began operations in 1968 and has played a leading role in the UK's national debate around race. Next slide, please. Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, JCWI, was founded in 1967 at a meeting of immigrant communities and anti-racism groups. The meeting was called in response to the introduction of new and harsh restrictions on immigration, an increase in racial attacks against migrant communities, and the failure of authorities to protect them. And finally, the Commission for Racial Equality, which was established by the Race Relations Act 1976, replacing the Community Relations Commission, and the CRE's work covered all the areas where people were protected against discrimination under the Race Relations Act. So it gave the Race Relations Act more power to have an organization that was helping to make the intention of the Race Relations Act become a reality. So we've just looked at those four. There were others, but NCCL was more or less in taking a legal route. The Runnymede Trust was a think tank. JCWI was specifically aimed at supporting immigrants, and CRE was an official organization. CARJ worked with all of them, and they still, well, I'll leave that till later. But they were an important factor alongside the legislation in creating an atmosphere of discrimination being a bad thing and a diverse society in living in mutual support and friendship being a good thing. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to look at two reports because these reports actually, a lot of work went into them and they were used by schools, even if schools didn't always do everything that was desired. But they gave us a picture of what people were trying to make happen in different parts of society. The Sewell Report in 1985. In 1979, the government established a committee of inquiry into the education of children from ethnic minority groups. After 6 years, that committee published its 800-page report, Education for All, in 1985. In its conclusions, the report emphasized that the important question was how to educate all children. So it was not just a matter of, as it were, separating Black children and making sure that they got a decent education. It was how to educate all children. And the title of the report was Education for All. All children must come to understand that Britain is a multicultural society and understand what that means. So in a classroom with white and Black children, all of them, it's the school's obligation that all of them must be helped to come to understand that Britain is a multicultural society and what that means. It's also necessary to combat racism and the myths and stereotypes and the ways in which they are embodied in institutional practice. Multicultural understanding must permeate all aspects of a school's work. So this was a vision back in 1985 that helped many to do what they thought was right, but it's always hard to live up to a really good vision. Next slide, please. The Gifford Report. Major disturbances between the police and the Black community on Broadwater Farm in 1985. led to an inquiry led by Lord Gifford. And their report was published in 1986. It was largely positive in thrust. So it didn't start out by criticizing the police, the community, everybody else. It took a positive approach and looked optimistically at the estate and its hope for the future, and the needs which were voiced to the inquiry were the following. There should be better cooperative policing. It's a good word, I think. Resources and support from central government would be needed in states like this. Investment and support for projects on or around the estate which would generate employment was needed. Continued development of community facilities on the estate. Better education for children and adults. And fair reporting in the media, and an end to the undesirable label put on the estate by other agencies. You can see that these recommendations looked in different directions at policing, at the need for resources for the community, at education, and in media reporting. Next slide, please. Now, I think I don't have enough time, but I'm going to try to go through some of these. We're going to look at a few individuals. And let me say at the start that over many years, the efforts to combat racism were often led by Black people. And the fuller story of these people you can find in 100 Great Black Britons. The people I refer to below and now are among the 100. And I hope these will give you a taste of the people whose lives are briefly described in this book. And I'd encourage you to read it. But for now, excuse me, I want to go through a few of the individuals. Dame Jocelyn Barrow was a prominent campaigner for racial equality and education reform. She co-founded the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARJ, and played a significant role in shaping policies against racial discrimination. Stuart Hall was a Jamaican-born cultural theorist and sociologist. He was a leading figure in the field of cultural studies and made significant contributions to understanding race, identity, and representation in British society. Darcus Howe, originally from Trinidad, he arrived in Britain as a teenager in 1961. He was a prominent Trinidad-born writer and broadcaster and civil rights activist. Gus John is a Grenadian-born writer, educator, campaigner, consultant, lecturer, and researcher who moved to the UK in 1964. He worked in the fields of education policy, management, and international development. Linton Kwesi Johnson, often referred to as LKJ, is a Jamaican British poet, reggae artist, and political activist. He came to London in 1953. His poetry and music shed light on the experiences of Black communities in Britain and addressed social and political issues. Claudia Jones, born Trinidad 1915. Sadly, she died in 1964. She lived in the USA until 1955 and then came to the UK. Known as the Mother of Notting Hill, Claudia Jones was an influential journalist, activist. She was a prominent figure in the Caribbean and African diaspora communities, advocating for racial and social justice. John LaRose was a political and cultural activist, poet, writer, publisher, founder in 1966 of New Beacon Books, the first specialist Caribbean publishing company in Britain, and he was subsequently chairman of the George Padmore Institute. And we still have New Beacon Books not far from here. Olive Morris was born on 26th of June 1952 in Jamaica and died in 1979 in London. She was a key figure in the British Black Panther movement and played a crucial role in various grassroots organizations, advocating for racial and gender equality. She was also involved in community activism and was known for her advocacy on housing issues. Additionally, she was a talented artist and focused on her creative endeavors alongside her activism. These are just a few examples of Black women and men who were influential activists and creative during the time period 1947 to 1985 in the UK. There were many others who made important contributions to the fight for equality and social change, and some of these are described in the book, 100 Great Black Britons. Next slide, please. So that's it. We've looked briefly at the legislation, the organizations, a couple key reports, and a few individuals of the many who have contributed to the effort to combat racism during the period 1947 to 1985. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that most interesting talk. I'm now going to give you 5 minutes. We were hoping for 10, but I think 5 minutes. If anybody has something really burning or that they want to say to Richard immediately, we have 5 minutes. If you put a hand in the corner of your screen, Gloria will see that and she'll tell Richard. So anyone who wishes to make comment on what they've just heard from Richard. Father Phil has something to say about Gus John.
No, I was just saying that he was, I think, a member of the Dominican order for a while. He trained, went through, became a Dominican, and then left. But he didn't remain a Catholic, but that was his background. That's all I was saying.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody want to add to anything that Richard has said or want to ask an immediate question? We've got 2 minutes. No, and if that's the case, I think we'll move on. Our second speaker is Patsy Cummins. Patsy is a local councillor, and she is also an associate to CARJ and has been for a number of years now. So Patsy is a very valuable worker to us. And tonight, she will be discussing some of the legislation positively that has influenced race relations since 1985. So she's going to take off where Richard has stopped. And she's going from 1985 to the present time. There have been many individuals and events that have shaped the UK race agenda. We're all aware of that. Patsy will obviously not have the time this evening in her 20 minutes to cover them all. So she's asking that you listen carefully, and then when we have the 20 minutes in our groups, that you will discuss those. So over to Patsy Cummins now. Thank you, Patsy.
So you muted. I can't. Can't hear Patsy.
Okay, thank you. I shall start again. Someone had to do it. Okay, good evening, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. So Richard has highlighted much of the earlier legislation that's been the foundation for later laws and commissions. And previous CARJ webinars have examined the historical and ongoing challenges we face to eliminate inequality, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination. Intolerance exists in all societies and harms not just the lives of the people who endure it, but also society as a whole. So the fight against racism should be everyone's fight. So how have we combated racism from 1985 to the present day? I would include some legislation, commissions, and events from the UK and from overseas. So next slide, please. The principles of the Human Rights Act 1998 are fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy, choice and control. These principles underpin all international human rights treaties, incorporating articles used in the Act and aligned with the Equality Act 2010. It defends our rights in the UK courts and compels public organisations, including the government, police, and local authorities, to treat everyone equally with fairness, dignity, and respect. Next slide, please. The International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is observed annually on 21st of March, the day the police in Sharpeville, South Africa, opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid pass laws in 1960. And the reason for me going back to this one, because as you can see, it's prior to 1985, but it actually leads on to some things that happened subsequently with regard to some of the work. In 1979, the General Assembly adopted a programme of activities to be undertaken during the second half of the decade for action to combat racism and racial discrimination. As we know, the apartheid system in South Africa has been dismantled, and racist laws and practices have been abolished in many countries. They've been abolished, but racism still exists. And an international framework for fighting racism has been built, guided by the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism produced the most authoritative and comprehensive programme for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. In September 2021, the United Nations General Assembly brought together world leaders for a one-day meeting in New York to mark the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and a programme of action under the theme of reparations. We can hear that a lot, I think, going forward. Racial justice and equality for people of African descent. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, which took over the responsibilities of the Commission of Racial Equality. Some liked some of the changes, some didn't. Monitors the EHRC monitors human rights, protecting equality across several grounds. Equality is about ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and talents. No one should have poorer life chances because of the way they were born, where they came from, what they believe, or whether they have a disability. Next slide, please. The Equality Act 2010 replaced previous anti-discrimination laws with a single act, making the law easier to understand and strengthening protection in some situations. It replaced the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, the Race Relations Act, as some of these Richard has gone through, the Race Relations Act in 1976, the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, and the Employment Equality, Religion or Belief Regulations of 2003. The Equality Act in 2010 legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society. The areas where where equal opportunities legislation applies are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. Next slide. The Bill of Rights Bill, introduced in Parliament in June 2022, aims to repeal and replace the Human Rights Act of 1998. This makes the rights contained in the European Convention on Human Rights domestically enforceable. The bill aims to enforce UK courts to apply human rights in a UK context, affirming the Supreme Court's independence from the Strasbourg Court. The bill makes explicit that the UK Supreme Court is the ultimate judicial arbiter. What does this mean for us? What rights are the government taking away? The UK government is introducing laws that is stripping away the rights of asylum seekers and other vulnerable people, encouraging voter disenfranchisement with limited judicial oversight of government actions and placing new restrictions on the right to peaceful protest. But hey, it was announced today, so pleased, on the 27th of June, 2 days ago, that the government will not be proceeding with the Bill of Rights bill. Next slide, please. Okay, events and individuals who shaped the 1980s through to the 2020s. Sadly, on the 17th of January, 1981, over 40 years ago, 13 young Black people died in a house fire at a birthday party in New Cross Road in Deptford. On the 22nd of April, 1993, A-level student Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a racist attack whilst waiting for a bus. Within 3 days of Stephen's death, prime suspects had been identified. However, they were not arrested until 2 weeks later and subsequently were not charged due to insufficient evidence. These tragic events led to, for the New Cross fire, 20,000 protesters marching across London, and an inquiry for Stephen Lawrence led by Sir William McPherson, which produced a 350-page report, which concluded that the investigation into the killing of Stephen has been marred by a combination of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership. So, what has changed following these tragedies and subsequent similar tragic events in combating race issues in the UK? Next slide, please. Well, in 1987 general election, we had the election to the House of Commons of 4 Black MPs to Parliament. Bernie Grant, Paul Boateng, Keith Vaz, and Diane Abbott became the country's first Black woman to become an MP. In the same year, Black History Month was made a feature and a fixture in the UK every October and continues to this day. Controversial for many, but we still have Black History Month. As we know, we want to make sure that Black history is part of British history, and it should be taught in history, in English, and it should be taught every single day. But that's another story, probably not time to delve into that right now. Next slide, please. The 1991 census showed that Black Londoners made up 500,000 people in a city of 7 million, and many were London or British born. This census was also the first to include a question on ethnicity, and the Black population of Great Britain was recorded as 890,727, or 1.6% of the total population. Next slide, please. So, 2005 to 2010, community cohesion. In the wake of the 9/11 and British 7/7 terrorist attacks, Islamophobia became widespread, and politicians pronounced multiculturalism as dead. Community cohesion evolved in response to faith-based concerns with Muslim communities living parallel lives in poverty in religiously segregated northern towns. It was safeguarding through controversial policies such as prevent, to stop terrorist attacks, to stop people becoming terrorists or support terrorism, to strengthen our protection against a terrorist attack, and to mitigate the impact of a terrorist attack. That's what prevent was meant to be doing. This shone a spotlight on Muslim communities, and schools were tasked with reporting pupils in danger of radicalisation and delivering British values. Next slide, please. Well, this is one of those occasions where people might think, can you remember where you were when this happened? I remember going to bed, actually, before the result came up, because I just had a feeling that this was going to happen. So on the 4th of November, 2008, Barack Obama, son of a Kenyan father and a mother with English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, German, and Swiss heritage, was elected the first Black president of the United States. And that had a profound influence on things that happened in America and, of course, what happened here. Did it mean that we no longer had racism in America? No. Did it have an influence and show a lot of our young people that anything was possible, no matter what the backdrop in the way in which they were living was possible? Yes, it did. Next slide, please. In October 2017, an independent review of deaths and serious incidences in police custody by Dame Elish Angolian, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, QC, was published, commissioned by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. The review called for action in tackling discrimination. The review made 110 recommendations to government departments, police forces in England and Wales, and public sector organisations. Many of them are cross-cutting and multidisciplinary in nature. In January 2018, the Independent Office for Police Conduct replaced the Independent Police Complaints Commission. The outgoing IPCC chair urged for the relationship between ethnicity and use of force to be looked at closely. In April 2018, a group of United Nations experts commented on structural racism being rooted at the heart of British society. The group of human rights experts cited police data showing a disproportionate number of people with ethnic minorities died as a result of excessive force. And in July 2021, the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights published a damning report calling on states, including the UK, to end impunity for human rights violations against Black people by police officers and reverse the culture of denial towards systemic racism, particularly in the context of policing and deaths in custody. And these deaths in custody still continue. A friend of mine, Aji Lewis, the mother of Shani Lewis in 2010, and he was a young man in the borough that I live in that had his first crisis. He took himself to the Bethlehem, and when he wanted to leave, because he was feeling a little bit agitated, the staff called the police, and 11 police officers, after he had been handcuffed and shackled, and 11 police officers laid on him until his body was limp. He later died in hospital. There's been a exhibition, and we're hoping to get it into the House of Parliament, of so many of the families of various different people from deaths in custody. And these things need to change. Next slide. So, on the 13th of March 2020, Breonna Taylor was fatally shot in her apartment when at least 7 police officers forced entry into her apartment as part of an investigation into drug dealing operations. On May 25th, 2020, many of us witnessed this on video. George Floyd, 46-year-old man, was murdered in Minnesota in the United States by Derek Chauvin, a 44-year-old white police officer. George had been arrested after a store clerk alleged that he had made a purchase using a counterfeit $20 bill. And as we all know, that death was captured on video. Now I'm highlighting some of the negativity because it's about what happened afterwards. So the outrage was felt throughout the world, especially with the George Floyd murder, and had a global impact on race relations, resulting in protests and movements such as Black Lives Matter. Some affected change, others very little. But outside of the US, the UK had the largest protests. Organisations, public and private sector, the media, faith institutions, and many more were called to action, as silence was no longer an option. And communities were invited to work together to not just call out racism, but to be actively anti-racist, to finally tackle the injustices staining our society. However, the impetus to make real change following these murders and subsequent events waned, and what rose sharply to the surface was a catalogue of unlawful police activity. So following Dame Cressida Dick announcing her resignation in February 2022, next slide please, Sir Mark Rowley was appointed as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police on the 8th of July 2022. Following the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer, Wayne Couzens, and a number of scandals that accuses the Met of being institutionally racist and corrupt, following a report by Baroness Casey, Sir Mark Rowley has given his assurance that he will tackle systemic bias and failings within the misconduct system through his new leadership team, as well as a number of actions he intends to take to improve the Met. Now that's just a slight whistle-stop tour of just some of the things that have either helped to improve race relations or some really tragic incidences which, as a result of those, perhaps things may start to change, but we still have a long way to go. Next slide, please. So, what's next? Well, there are so many issues, but not enough that we've been able to tackle and completely eradicate. But today, the Court of Appeal has today ruled that the Rwanda plan is unlawful. What they said is Rwanda could not be deemed a safe third country as there is a risk that asylum seekers could be sent back to their home countries. And that changes to policy had to be put forward. Now the government may still appeal, and I think they will appeal, and they'll use our taxpayers' money to do that. But small victories. And so I think I'll stop there, and I will just say thank you for listening and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patsy. Interesting, very, very interesting. If anyone has a question before we go into our groups that you want to direct to Patsy, you have 5 minutes. Or should I say, we have 5 minutes. So if anyone wishes to make a comment or wants to say something to Patsy, now's the opportunity. Joseph?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for very interesting presentations. One thought I had in my mind was that whilst the legislative framework is very useful, legislation only covers behavior. It does not change attitudes. And that's quite important. But I wonder whether both speakers can perhaps comment. There's been a number of very useful reports with a considerable number of recommendations. Why is it that these recommendations have not been brought forward?
Go on, Betsy.
Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, and this is a personal view, there hasn't been, you're right, legislation is there, and we've had so many bits of legislation for so many years, but it's the will to actually implement that legislation. It's about how we roll that out, how we do things differently, and it's got to be where the whole society takes responsibility for things to change. So it's not just about people who look like us, people who are in that arena that will actually make those changes or work towards it. It's got to be all of us. Getting that buy-in is one of the most difficult things I think that we're going to have to do. So that's my take on it. Legislation, reports sit on shelves, gather dust, but it's about how we make that, how we roll that out. And I think some of the work that CARJ has been doing, some of the work we started doing in schools, it's where we can start to implement things. With young people, we need to do far much more in shouting louder, getting people on board. But I think we're 2023, we've still got such a long way to go.
Richard, would you like to add to that? Thank you, Patsy. You're muted, Richard.
Sorry. Just to say, Patsy said in passing, and I think it's important that bad things happen and the government or someone in power asks, what are we going to do about it? Well, let's have an inquiry. And the inquiry takes a year or a few years and does a really good job and publishes its report. And by that time, people have forgotten about it. There's a bit of publicity and then it sits on a shelf. But that's not all. Like the report Education for All that I referred to and others, when people like CARJ, like ourselves, like others, decide to try to do something, they have that good report as background. And it's possible to use it and to learn from it in order to work more intelligently, and to use it also to make our case to society. So they don't just sit on shelves, but they're only as useful as people like ourselves make them in the work that we try to do, I think.
Thanks, Richard. Brendan?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I think, the idea of legislation, I mean, and the value of legislation, I know often it appears to be enacted and then no one acts on it, or there's not sufficient action on it. But I don't think we should underestimate the significance, because there's plenty of evidence now that if we change the rules and procedures, eventually some people adapt their attitudes to conform with the practice. I mean, this is my experience of working in schools, particularly in this area. You do something on racial justice in schools, it can very often be controversial, and people can rise up against it, But it was my experience that I found that 18 months or 2 years down the line, the opinion consensus within the school had moved to the line in which we had started it, And very often people who were strong opponents, you'd hear them a couple of years down the line expressing it as their idea. And I was always happy for that to happen. But, you know, I don't think we should, you know, we should be encouraged by the importance of changing the rules and procedures. Eventually, there is evidence that eventually we conform our attitudes, we change our attitudes to conform to those practices.
Thank you, Brendan. Paul?
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, I raised my clap icon instead of the raised hand icon before. I think as well as the law, which is very important, I think the whole equalities infrastructure is also important. And among that infrastructure, I would include interfaith work. When the coalition came to power, they did away with regionalization. So many of the regional interfaith networks were obliterated. I understand now that the UK Interfaith Network is no longer going to be funded by the government. So my question really is, do you think that interfaith work is important in this whole area of equalities and race equality?
Richard, will I ask you to answer that, Paul? And then after that, we'll get Father Phil.
I definitely do think it's important. I think it's important in its own right, but I think as part of the whole racial justice effort, it's also very important. Because a lot of the racism that exists under the flag, if you want, of religion. I don't know what more to say, but I feel intuitively that the answer to your question is yes, it's hugely important.
Thank you, Richard. Patsy, did you want to add to that?
Yes, could I? When I first got involved with CARJ and obviously found out about the history of CARJ, people of faith coming together, challenging the Council of Bishops when they saw racism in the wider society, but obviously they saw racism within the church. And over, what's the anniversary now? Is it 40 years, 50 years? I've
40
lost
years.
count. 40 years. The work that's been done by people just coming together. So I've got faith in people as, yes, we have to have the legislation, but people of faith and of no faith. But you can just see the power of people of faith coming together, and I think it's hugely important. Absolutely, I would say interfaith, and even though it's not funded, I think there's still and the ability for that to continue in whatever shape and form it can.
Thank you, Patsy. Father Phil?
Just to continue that for a moment and to link it what I was going to say anyway, the interfaith aspect actually begins to have an impact on something else that's going on. For example, the disappearance or the questioning of multiculturalism was really because of the coming in or the interface with Islam, and especially what was considered to be illiberal Islam. And that's then made people say, well, people have got to change and accept British values when they come into our society. But then the other aspect of this is the things that are going on in the background that are enabling the Tony Sewell Report to come out with such an approach to suggest that we're in an age of participation these days. There's a book that's just been published fairly recently anyway by Tomiwa Awolade. I don't know if you've heard of him. There's just been a piece on him in the tablets as well, but he is questioning the critical race theory. As a black guy from Ghana, he's questioning critical race theory and saying we should be avoiding. The book is, I can't remember what the book's called, I'll tell you now. This is not America. So there's a suggestion that although Black Lives Matter came from America, although the George Floyd thing that we just heard about from Patsy caused a massive impact in terms of what we did over here as well, this guy, who's very intelligent guy, is saying we're not America, and whilst he's not saying we're in a post-racial society, he is suggesting that we should have a different approach. Now, it's this sort of thing that we should be, I think, more aware of, so we can see what is happening, because it's all having that impact underneath, whether it's the effect of the reaction to what is seen to be illiberal Islam, or the belief that we're actually doing very well now for Black people in our society, which is what Tamiwa suggests, as well as Tony Sewell. We need to be aware of that and be able to counter it, or have a debate with it, or engage with it in some way.
Thank you, Father Phil. I'm just looking at the time. We do want to put you into groups now, because I think when we're in smaller groups, it will give the opportunity for everyone to be able to have his or her say. So Gloria will put you into 3 groups. We will come into the groups, but we'll be there to listen rather than to participate, because it is important that we listen to what others have to say. So we'll go into groups for 20 minutes. And if every group would get someone to report back just for 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, if each group would come back to report for 3 to 4 minutes at the end, that will be really, really good. I hope that will be okay with everyone. Please give everyone an opportunity within the group to have his or her say. Gloria, would you put us into 3 groups, please? We'll just wait for everybody to come back.
I think we're all here now.
Thanks, Gloria. I'm going to ask everybody to be muted yet again. And we'll hear from the 3 people who are going to report back one at a time. Gloria, you have the grouping, so I'm going to depend upon you to tell me who would be in group 1.
I think
Please.
they'll just step forward.
Yeah, okay, that was going to be me for the group.
Thanks, Brendan.
Yeah, I'll just be as quick as I can, because I think the discussion is really good, isn't it? We began by being heartened by the Supreme Court decision today. This is a positive and helpful spirit. The other thing was the fact that the Bill of Rights has been withdrawn. Again, that was 2 things to make us feel encouraged. One of the members of the group, and we discussed it a little bit, was saying that had the Labour movement and the racial equality movement worked more closely together in the past, we would probably be a long way better along the road than we are at the moment. And so that was seen as one of the things that a regret that we haven't, that those 2 movements really didn't work as passionately and as intimately as they could have. Had they done so, their struggle may have well have been more productive than it has been to date. We then talked about, we talked a little bit of saying how disturbing it was when we thought of some of the tragedies which were highlighted during the 2 introductions at the beginning, the New Cross fire tragedy and so on. We talked about the tragedy and the awfulness of all of that. And then we're trying to avoid talking about the bishops, but we did talk about them quite a bit, okay? And there was the lack of response from the bishops over the years is at least disappointing, and probably we should use stronger wording than that, I don't want to encroach on Father Phil's contribution next week, because I know that's where he's coming from. Okay, just to say that also that we talked about the the criticism that's coming at situations such as or philosophy such as the critical race theory and so on. The movement or the impression that some would give that we're in a post-racist society is real cause for concern, and that we need to actually make sure that we keep racism as articulate and high profile and explicit in public discourse, and resist the temptation of understating the severity and the seriousness of the situation at the moment and exaggerating the progress that hasn't been made, really, or exaggerating the progress that has been made. And then we finished up with just by someone quoting Pope Francis, saying that racism is like a virus which mutates as it proceeds, and we saw that as as a really enlightening and encouraging statement, if it coming from Pope Francis. And finally, we summed up by saying that we need to recognise racism where it is, name it, and that's the reality of of the current time, by making sure that we know what the issues are. In my mind came, I think it was Archbishop Romero who said, you need to name the sin, but also we should name the sinner. And the bishops have a tendency to talk about things like immigration and so on, which they see as being softer than the word racism. Real reluctance for them to use racism. The situation may well be that we need to practice naming the sinner as well as
Thanks,
the sin.
Brendan. Thanks, Brendan. That was brilliant. Can we have the second group? I'm going to race you a little bit now because we only have 6 minutes left. So second group, please.
Okay, I think that's us. So thank you. And actually, again, it was a really lively conversation. There was thanks for the webinars as an approach that CARJ are doing, as sometimes it's a feeling of things haven't changed, but at least it highlighted where there has been progress that we do need to acknowledge. However, at the same time, we did fall into the conversations about the support of the church, or the feelings of lack of support, really, and the significant impact it's had, such as not having financial support from Racial Justice Sunday, but also psychological, theological, and spiritual support from the church in relation to racism. We talked about there being Black priests, but questioned how much they feel supported or welcomed in their communities, and also by others in the church in positions of power. We talked about ethnic minorities, that often they're people of faith, of very strong faith. However, very often they are not in positions where they can make decisions. They're not made to feel welcome. Someone mentioned it as the white angels, and it is all, when you see angels, they're all white still, and that people aren't always necessarily aware of the experiences of people and the amount of racism that there is in the church. What else? I wish I'd written with better handwriting all of this, but we talked about making the church a more welcome place for migrants, and how the Catholic Church actually is more diverse than the other denominations, but we have a long way to go in terms of making people feel welcome. I think they're the main things.
I think you did, yes. Thank you very much. And our last group, got 3 minutes for the last group, please. Margaret Ann, is it? Unmute, Margaret Ann.
I'm afraid we were not as organized as the other groups. we got straight into the discussion without actually appointing anybody to take any notes. So it's just a quick run through. We started off with the critical race theory, which there was a view perhaps that things are actually going backwards in this country as opposed to forward. That was indeed, there was a little bit of a challenge there, because I think there is a risk of actually being too negative about things. Things have improved, not as fast and not as wide. And one thing which we did stress is perhaps the education bit is a strand that needs to be pushed to change people's attitudes and also to really, truly understand what racism actually means and what and what a multicultural society consists of. It doesn't mean that people lose their values, right? We need to be look at what is common across our ethnic minority groups and then pull together. Margaret Ann, anything else you want to add?
Just that we said that in this day and age we have to remember that racism is not a black and white issue.
Yes.
That we have racisms in the society.
Yes.
And it's much broader than a lot of people perceive it to be. That's the only thing I would add, Joe.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Margaret Ann. We've got 1 minute left, unless there's somebody with a burning comment to be made or a burning question to be asked. It's always interesting, isn't it, when you're pushing right to the very last second. I really appreciate that. It's a topic we can speak on for weeks to come, and I'm sure there'll still be lots more to be said. Can I just say a very, very big thank you to Richard and to Patsy for their wonderful presentations, and a very big thank you to all of you for your participation and for your interest in wanting to combat racism within the country and within the church. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. Please, please, please go out and make sure you advertise the following 4 webinars to all your friends and family. The more people come together to discuss these matters, the more we're going to work towards ending racism. So everyone's help is most certainly needed. And on that note, may I wish you all a very pleasant evening and God's richest blessings.